The woman who entered the wolf's house. That night, as Celine Vale stepped into the mansion of the man who struck fear into all of New York, she didn't know she was trading one trap for another, only the second one was more beautiful and 100 times more dangerous. This is the story of an ordinary woman, a wolf with an unhealed wound, and the thin line between redemption and devouring. If you're watching to the end, hit like and leave your city name in the comments. I want to know how far this story has come. The rain poured down on South Brooklyn as if the sky were deliberately trying to drown something. It wasn't a light drizzle, not the romantic kind of rain you'd find in novels. This was a hard, cold rain, pounding against the window pane like fists. The kind of rain that only appears on nights when everything is about to fall apart. Celine Vale knew it from the moment she sat on the bus, watching the streaks of water run down the frosted window pane and feeling something tighten in her chest. Not her heart, not her lungs. Something deeper, older. An instinct she'd learned at 7. When the air smells like this, slow down. Observe before stepping in. But that night, she didn't observe long enough. She had just finished her final shift of clinical practice. 3 years of nursing school in Albany. 3 years living in cramped dorm rooms with the smell of disinfectant permeating every fiber of her clothing. 3 years of deliberately distancing herself from everything that South Brooklyn represented. Her mother, the old apartment building, the man her mother called husband. She had almost convinced herself that she had escaped, that 3 years was enough time for a person to change course. Almost. The first sound she heard as she climbed the stairs was the shattering of a glass. She stopped on the 8th step, her hand gripping the rusty iron railing, and listened. Inside apartment 4C, there was a man's voice, not speaking, a growl, the kind of sound that comes from a throat when someone is drunk enough to forget they're still human. Then a bang. Something heavy hit the kitchen wall, and then, short, cut off, her mother's voice. Celine climbed the remaining 4 steps without a second thought. She didn't have time to get the keys. The door swung open. Diego Ramos never locked the door when he was drunk, because when he was drunk he feared nothing, not even the outside world, and Celine walked straight in. The living room was messy in the typical way of the nights Diego came home from the bar. Chairs pushed askew, empty bottles scattered on the floor. The thick smell of cheap bourbon permeated the air. The yellowish light from the kitchen shone through the doorway. Mireya Vale stood pressed against the refrigerator, one hand clutching her side, her head bowed. Her hair fell across her face. On the white tile floor lay the shattered pieces of a blue porcelain plate, a plate she had kept since her time in the Dominican Republic, the only plate she had brought with her to America 23 years earlier. Diego Ramos stood in the middle of the kitchen with red eyes and his hands reaching for something to throw next. He looked at Celine. "So you're back?" It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, in the peculiar way of someone so drunk they'd lost track of noise and were heading towards something worse. "Do you think you're any different just because you came home from school?" "Diego." Celine set the bag down on the floor, slowly, without making a sound. She'd learned this long ago. When dealing with a drunken beast, avoid any unnecessary provocation. "It's nighttime. Mother needs to rest. I haven't finished talking to her yet." "Yes." Celine walked into the kitchen. "It's here." He looked at her in a way she'd known since she was 15, the look of someone weighing the true limits. Then he laughed. Not a laugh of amusement, the kind of laugh one gets when they think they have nothing to lose. "Who do you think you are?" She didn't answer. She went straight to her mother. Mireya looked up as she approached, and she saw immediately. Her left eye was swollen, her lip bitten inward to suppress the pain, the way she held her left arm close to her body as if she had a broken rib or a torn cartilage. Celine placed her hand on her mother's shoulder and felt the woman's body tremble. "Let's go outside, Mom." "You're not going anywhere." Diego walked closer. She turned to stand in front of her mother. It was a reflex, without thinking. Just something her body did on its own before her brain could intervene. Diego Ramos was nearly 20 centimeters taller than her. He weighed 60 kilograms more. And he had what drunkards often have, a complete disregard for consequences. He grabbed her arm like one grabs a twig, his fingers wrapping almost around Celine's wrist, and squeezed. She didn't scream. She learned not to scream a long time ago. But she felt pressure on her bones. Not enough to break them, but enough to know that the next morning there would be purple, finger-shaped marks eating into her flesh. Behind her, Mrs. Mireya was trying to say something, maybe Diego's name, maybe a plea, She couldn't hear clearly because the blood was pounding so loudly in her ears. Then the doorbell rang. All three stood still. Diego's phone rang. He let go of her hand, looked at the screen, and something in his expression changed. Not regret, not shame. Just the kind of sudden realization one gets when called back to reality for some other reason. He answered, said a few short words, then grabbed his coat and went outside without looking back. The door closed. Celine stood in the kitchen, staring at the shards on the floor and feeling her body begin to tremble. Not from fear, because the adrenaline had nowhere to escape. Mireia sat down on the kitchen counter. She sat down next to her mother, shone her phone's flashlight into her eyes to check her pupil reflex, then gently felt along her mother's left ribs. Mireia held her breath as she reached the fifth rib. Does it hurt here? It's all right, son. Mom. Celine looked straight into her mother's eyes. I asked if it hurt. Mireia looked away. It only hurts a little. Celine sat up straight and looked at the kitchen, the broken porcelain, the smell of alcohol, the yellowish light on the face of the woman who had worked tirelessly for 23 years to raise her. Mireia Vale had been cleaning houses for others since Celine couldn't read. She had done everything necessary to ensure her daughter could go to college, could leave this place, could do something else. And now she sat in her own kitchen with potentially fractured ribs, in the apartment of a man who didn't love her but just needed someone at home waiting for him. Does Mom have a shift tomorrow morning? Celine asked, even though she already knew the answer. Mireia nodded. Mr. Vexley's house, every Thursday. She knew that name. Anyone who had lived in New York long enough knew that name, Lucian Vexley. Not in the way one knows a politician or an actor. It was in the way one knows a storm, not needing to see it firsthand, just hearing enough to understand that one shouldn't stand near its path. Mom can't go in this condition. You wouldn't understand, Mireia said calmly, as if she had long since accepted it. I have no choice but to go. Then I'll go instead. Silent. Mireia looked at her daughter, then she shook her head. Celine, I know how to do housework. I've been helping Mom since I was 12. She stood up and began picking up the broken pieces of porcelain on the floor. Go to sleep, Mom. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. It was a simple, practical decision, nothing special about it. She was just filling in for her mother for one day. She didn't know Lucian Vexley's name. She didn't know what the mansion behind the black iron fence in the north of the city looked like inside. And she certainly didn't know that the decision she made that evening would change everything that would happen in the rest of her life. She only knew that her mother couldn't go to work with a fractured rib. So she left. Vexley Mansion is located behind a nearly 4-meter-high black iron fence at the end of a private road not found on Google Maps. Celine stood at the gate at 5:45 a.m., clutching the shaky handwriting her mother had given her the night before. Names, staff numbers, security check procedures, and a 2-page list of what was and wasn't allowed inside. The paper had a bold underline at the bottom. Do not enter the master bedroom unless instructed otherwise. The surveillance camera was pointed at her. She looked directly into the camera and held up the piece of paper. 2 minutes later, the gate opened. The security checker was a man named Garrett, around 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough to be unimpressed by anything. He looked at the papers she handed him, looked at her, then back at the papers. Miss Vale isn't coming. She was injured. I am her daughter, Celine Vale. Not on the list. I know, she said calmly. She couldn't have called last night. Can I speak to the person in charge? Garrett looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he spoke into his earpiece and waited. Celine stood in the early morning breeze, the scent of tulips wafting from the garden inside, and tried not to look up at the house emerging from behind the trees. Larger than she had imagined, so quiet that it felt as if all the sounds from outside were being sucked in and disappearing. The person in charge of internal affairs was Helena Marsh. 60 years old, with gray hair neatly tied back, and a voice that carried the weight of someone who had managed the team long enough to ask no unnecessary questions. She looked at Celine with a quick, assessing glance, neither friendly nor hostile. Do you know the procedure? My mother left a note, Celine said, handing over the piece of paper. Mrs. Marsh read it, folded it, returned it. The agent's bathroom and the living room first. The library last. Don't touch the master bedroom unless I tell you to. She paused. Is there anything you need to ask? Or not? Good. She turned away. Follow me. Morten. Inside Vexley Manor, the silence has its own unique texture. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a place where people had practiced making no sound. Staff moved through the marble corridors like purposeful ghosts. No talking, no eye contact for too long, no footsteps echoing. Celine learned her lesson after about 15 minutes and found herself beginning to shrink, walking more lightly, breathing less. The house wasn't decorated in the typical wealthy style. No gold or extravagant paintings. The walls were ash gray, the furnishings dark, and the lighting carefully calculated so it wasn't too bright in any corner. The built-in bookshelves held not display books, but actual books that had been read, old spines, some with bookmarks. Celine read a few titles as she walked past. Journal of Trauma Surgery, Neuroanatomy, Clinical Management of Chronic Pain. She paid attention and continued on her way. The morning's chores were nothing special. Wiping, vacuuming, cleaning windows, tidying. These were things she'd done with her mother since childhood, enough for her hands to remember before her mind could even think. She worked methodically, without rushing, and without looking at unnecessary things. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Marsh came to find her in the upstairs hallway. "The master bedroom," she said. "Mr. Vexley is at a meeting at 8 o'clock. He won't be back before noon. Hurry." Celine nodded. The master bedroom was at the end of the hallway, behind a dark wooden door so heavy it took a whole person to push it open. Inside it was spacious and dark. The curtains were drawn. The air was colder than the rest of the house. There was the smell of old wood and something sharper, the kind of smell a man who doesn't wear expensive cologne but uses good soap. The bed was large but tidy, one side used, the other never showing any sign of being touched. She started by the fireplace. This was her least favorite task, kneeling on the floor and scrubbing the baseboards around the fireplace, where dust and ash clung in a way that no broom could remove, requiring only her hands. She did it in silence, the small brush scraping against the stone edge. Her head bowed. That's why she didn't hear the door open. When she looked up, she saw a figure reflected in the fireplace glass for a second before turning away. Lucian Vexley stood in the middle of the room. She had never seen him in person, but she recognized him instantly, not by his face, by the way he stood. There are people who, when they walk into a room, the space automatically adjusts around them. Not because they're trying to make an impression, but because they've been in so many rooms long enough that they no longer need to prove anything. I was about 38 or 39. Dark hair, not cut neatly enough, but not long enough to be considered sloppy. A dark gray suit, his tie undone and held in his hand. The kind of person who just left a meeting and tore off the most formal thing in the world. There was a small scratch on the back of his right hand that she immediately recognized as a mark from someone who'd been hit by the edge of a table during a physical altercation. Not old, not new, about a week old. He looked at her, showed no expression, just stared. "She's not Mireia." Not a question. "No." Celine stood up. "I am her daughter. She couldn't come today. Mrs. Marsh has—" "I know," he interrupted, not rudely, just briefly. "Mrs. Marsh called me." Celine nodded, intending to return to her work. Then she saw his gaze linger on her, not on her face. Lower down, on her wrist. She instinctively looked down. Her sleeve had slipped up while she was kneeling, scrubbing the fireplace. A clear purple bruise was visible on her skin, 5 finger-sized rings, the characteristic purplish-brown color of a fresh bruise less than 24 hours old. So distinct that anyone with any medical knowledge would know immediately it was the mark of someone being gripped tightly with an unwillingness to let go. She pulled her sleeve down. Lucian Vexley said nothing. He stared at her long enough for her to feel like everything in the room was being read, not in an admiring or curious way, more like someone gathering data. Then he slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. Don't stand looking down at her. Sit, at eye level. Eat. One word, no questioning, no pity, heavy and flat like concrete. Celine looked at him. It's none of your business. Maybe. He didn't argue. But I'm asking. She didn't know why she answered. Perhaps it was because she hadn't slept and was so tired that her reason was lagging behind her emotions. Perhaps it was because he wasn't feigning concern in the way people usually do. No contorted, pitying expression, no apologetic look that made the person being looked at feel insignificant. Perhaps it was simply because this was the first time in years someone had asked, and she believed they genuinely wanted to hear the answer. My stepfather. Lucian said nothing. He didn't react. He sat still and waited. She didn't know how much she had said. She only knew that at some point she stopped and the bedroom was completely silent, and he was still sitting there with the same expression, or rather, expressionless. But there was something in his eyes that she couldn't read. Is your mother home right now? Have. Are you alone? The question sent a chill down her spine. Diego left last night. Usually he disappears a few days after. She stopped. Lucian stood up. He took out his phone and dialed a number. A short call, no explanation, just an address read out, and 3 words before hanging up. She couldn't hear what those 3 words were. Your mother will be brought here, he said, looking straight into her eyes. Today. Celine opened her mouth, then closed it. He doesn't need... I know I didn't need to, his voice was even. But I did. Mireia Vale arrived at Vexley Manor at 11:20, seated in the back seat of a black, unmarked car, her face showing the uncertainty of whether she was awake or dreaming. Celine met her mother at the gate and watched her emerge, one hand still clutching her side, her eyes red but devoid of tears. Mireia Vale hadn't cried in public in a long time. What are you doing? She whispered. I didn't do anything. Celine helped her mother inside. He made the decision. Mrs. Marsh arranged 2 adjacent rooms for them in the service wing of the building, small but clean, with windows overlooking the garden and locked from the inside. Celine helped her mother lie down, checked her ribs, determined they were fractured rather than broken, and would take at least 4 weeks to heal without further impact. Mireia looked up at the ceiling. I can't stay here. Okay. Celine sat on the edge of the bed. So where's Mom going? Silent. Who is he, Mom? Celine asked. Who is Lucian Vexley, really? Mireia closed her eyes. He's the man my mother worked for 13 years and never understood. She paused. But he never harmed anyone without reason. That's not a compliment. No? Her mother opened her eyes and looked straight up. But it's the truth. That afternoon, Celine was sitting in the annex kitchen. Not the main kitchen, the small staff kitchen at the end of the hallway, when Garrett came to see her. Mr. Vexley wants to see you. She followed. Lucian was standing in the library when she entered, a room of floor-to-ceiling books, 3 walls, the afternoon light streaming in from the tall windows. He stood looking out, holding an unopened book. Sit down. She sat down. He turned, looked at her for a second, then pulled up a chair and sat opposite her. Between them was a dark wood reading table with a glass of water and a piece of paper. You're studying nursing. Almost finished my 3rd year. Why? The question was so unexpected that it took her a second to process it. Why am I studying nursing? Why nursing and not something else? She looked at him. Because I knew how to read injuries before I knew how to read. Lucian Vale didn't react with any expression, but something about his posture changed. Not much, just the way he set the book down on the table, a little slower than before. Diego Ramos, he said. Does he have a job? Have. Where? Marchettius warehouse at the port. He nodded. He offered no further explanation. He looked out the window. She didn't ask him what he intended to do. She had sat in enough hospital rooms long enough to recognize when a decision had already been made and they were merely going through the superficial process of informing him. How long? She asked. He looked back at her. How long what? Before he's no longer a problem. A smile. Not a joyful smile. A smile of realization. Tonight. She nodded. She stood up. Celine. She stopped at the door. Your mother will stay here until she gets better. Not a question, not a suggestion. And so will you. She turned to look at him, the man standing in his library with the afternoon light falling on his ash-colored coat, the man all of New York feared, the man she knew nothing about except for the 3 hours she'd spent in this house. And she didn't know why, in that moment, she felt something more dangerous than anything Diego Ramos had ever made her feel. There's no need to be afraid. Something worse than fear. Something that looks very much like trust. She nodded once and walked out. That night, at 3 in the morning, Celine lay listening to the wind outside her window and thinking about all the reasons why she should pack her bags and leave that morning. She thought about medical rules, about professional ethics, about what people learn in nursing school about the boundaries between caregiver and patient. Even though it wasn't this situation, there was still something similar. She thought about all the valid and reasonable reasons. Then she thought about her mother's arms, The way she hugged herself to hide the pain. The way she closed her eyes in this small room and slept for the first time in months without the sound of footsteps at night on the wooden floor outside the door. She didn't leave the next morning. The next morning, Garrett brought her a cup of coffee and informed her that Diego Ramos had called Maria Vale at 7 o'clock and apologized. He didn't elaborate on the details of the previous night's encounter. He only said that he wouldn't be returning to the apartment and that Maria could retrieve her belongings at any time. Celine held the coffee cup in both hands, gazed out at the garden still damp with morning dew, and felt something in her chest move in a way she couldn't explain and wasn't sure she wanted to try to explain. This was the first day in her life she didn't know what it felt like when danger disappeared, because she had never lived long enough without it. And what she didn't know, something no one in this house had told her, was that the danger didn't disappear. It just changed shape. It just found a different way to get through the door. And the door she just walked through wasn't the door leading outside. 3 days later, Celine found the notebook in a library drawer. Not intentionally, but because she was cleaning and accidentally pulled out the wrong drawer. The notebook was thin, with a black cover and no name. She was about to close it immediately, but the paper fell out. This is my medical school transcript. Name on it, Lucian Vexley, Department of Surgery. 3rd year. Year dropped out, 2011. That was the same year our father was assassinated. Celine stood in the library with a piece of paper in her hand, looking towards the door where she had just heard familiar footsteps approaching. He'll be inside in 10 seconds. And she didn't know if she was allowed to know this, the most important thing about the man all of New York feared, that he had once been someone else, and that person wasn't quite dead. The paper wasn't heavy, it wasn't thick, just a regular printed page, the top corner yellowed as if it had been left in a dark drawer for too long. But Celine held it as if it were something that could explode. Transcript. Cornell Medical School. Department of General Surgery. Name, Lucian A. Vexley. Grades spanning 2.5 years. Not grades the student earned because required. Grades the student earned because they genuinely wanted to. Advanced Anatomy. A. Pathophysiology. A. Basic Surgical Techniques. A-. And at the very end, small italicized text, withdrawn from the program. November 2011. Reason, family circumstances. Family circumstances. Celine knew what that family situation was like. All of New York knew. Victor Vexley was shot dead in the garage of this mansion in October 2011, 4 bullets to the chest, 1 to the head. The kind of ending that sends a message, not an act. And his only son, a 3rd-year surgical student, returned and never went back to school, footsteps in the hallway. Celine didn't have time to think. She tucked the paper back into the notebook, closed the drawer, and turned around. Her hand was still trembling slightly. She pressed it against her thigh and pretended to wipe the surface of the bookshelf. Lucian entered the library. He looked at her. He looked at the drawer. He looked back at her. He said nothing. She continued wiping. Her hand held the cloth but didn't actually move. She just stood still and looked like she was working. The room was so quiet she could hear him set his glass down on the reading table, the sound of his chair being pulled out, the sound of him opening a book. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. What did you find? Not a question. Celine stopped what she was doing. She turned to look at him. Lucian was looking down at the open book in front of him, not at her, but there was something in his posture that was completely focused on the room. She didn't answer immediately. She set the towel down, went to the drawer, opened it, and took out the notebook. She placed it on the table in front of him. Lucian looked at the notebook. He looked at her. The paper fell out, she said. I didn't mean to read it, but she's already read it. Have. He closed the open book. He placed his hand on the black-covered notebook but didn't open it. He looked towards the window where the afternoon light streamed in at a low angle, typical of autumn. What do you want to say about that? I don't want to say anything. Celine pulled up a chair and sat opposite him. I just wanted you to know that I saw it. Why? She thought seriously. Not the kind of thinking aimed at finding the right answer, the kind of thinking aimed at finding the real answer. Because if I pretended not to see, I would be lying. And I'm not good at lying to someone who did what he did to my mother. Lucian looked back at her. This time he looked straight into her eyes, not away. Cornell was 15 years ago. I know. That person no longer exists. That's what he said, she said without looking away. But he had a trauma surgery journal in his bedroom. He recognized my mother's fractured ribs by looking at how she breathed. And when Mrs. Marsh told me that he had instructed the security team to bring my mother here, he had instructed them to lift her into the car in a way that wouldn't put pressure on her left rib. A long silence. That person no longer exists, he repeated, but this time in a different tone. Not to convince her, to remind himself. Celine didn't argue. She stood up, took a cloth, and continued wiping the bookshelves. The conversation ended the way truly important conversations usually end, not with a concluding statement, but with what lingered in the air after the words had been spoken. On her 5th day in the mansion, Celine began to understand the structure of the place. It wasn't the physical structure. She'd grasped that after the first day. It was the internal social structure, the way power moved through space along paths not mapped out. Garrett was the head of security. Mrs. Marsh ran all the internal operations, but both of them paused and waited when they heard certain footsteps in the hallway. Not Lucian, but the other man. The man whose name she only learned 2 days later, Marcus Hale. She first met him in the main kitchen early in the morning. Marcus Hale was about 45, with a sharp face and the manner of someone who didn't care much about his appearance, but always dressed appropriately. He poured coffee and looked at Celine over the cup, as if he had already decided everything about her before she even entered the room. Miss Vale. Mr. Hale? She knows who I am. I asked someone else. He set his glass down. How long will you be staying here? Until my mother gets better. She's almost better. Not being friendly. Just stating the truth in a second way. Celine poured water into the kettle. I understand what you mean. Good. He picked up his glass, intending to leave. He stopped. You're intelligent. I think you're intelligent enough to know that some things in this house aren't for outsiders. Like what? As for his attention, Marcus looked at her. There was no malice in his eyes, which worried her more than if he had. He has no friends. He has no personal hobbies. He has work, and he has enemies. Anyone who becomes something else to him becomes a target. Are you warning me? I'm explaining the facts. He stepped out of the kitchen door, pausing at the doorway. Do you have any plans after graduation? Have. Good. He didn't turn around. Stick with that plan. On Friday evening, Lucian did not have dinner in the main dining room. Mrs. Marsh told Celine not to explain, but because she had been tasked with bringing a cup of tea to the library, a routine her mother had followed for 13 years, and Mrs. Marsh wanted to maintain that routine so as not to disrupt the family's daily life. Celine knocked on the door. There was no answer, but the door wasn't locked, so she pushed it open. Lucian sat on the floor. He wasn't sitting in a chair and about to fall. He was sitting directly on the wooden floor, his back against the leg of the reading table. His legs stretched out in front of him, a thick book open on his lap. The reading lamp shone down from above, creating a narrow patch of light around him, the rest of the room dark. He wasn't wearing a suit. This was the first time she'd seen him in a casual shirt, unbuttoned at the top, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. On her left wrist, she saw a long scar running along her forearm bone. It wasn't a surgical incision, too irregular to be surgical. It was the mark of something else. He lifted his head, looked at her, looked at the teacup, said nothing. She placed the teacup on the small table nearby and prepared to leave. What year are you studying anatomy? She paused. Year 2. Is it difficult? The question was so strange that she didn't know if she should answer truthfully. Then she decided to, partially. The main problem is having to memorize so many names in such a short time. He looked down at the book on his lap. I remember that first neuroanatomy test. I studied for 3 days straight and still got the location of the basal ganglia wrong on the exam. Celine looked at him, the man sitting on the floor of her library with a medical book on his lap, talking about the test 15 years ago as if it were just last week. She pulled a pillow over herself and sat down on the floor, about a meter away from him. Did he pass? A B-. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. The worst grade in 2.5 years. A B- isn't a bad grade. That paper is terrible. He turned to the next page. I know the material. I just didn't get enough sleep, and my hands were shaking while writing. She glanced at the book on his lap. The cover was worn, the pages marked with small paper annotations. Cardiovascular Physiology, published 2009. He still reads medical books. It wasn't a question. He knew it wasn't a question, so he didn't answer in a questioning way. Reading and doing are 2 different things. Would you like to do it again? This time the silence lasted longer. Outside the window, the wind made the branches of the trees rattle against the glass. That question doesn't have a simple answer. I'm not asking for a simple answer. He looked at her. This time he looked longer than before, as if he were deciding whether or not to believe what he was seeing. Not every door can be reopened once it's closed, he said flatly, and not everyone should try to open them. Celine pondered the question. Maybe not everyone believes they deserve to reopen. The room's temperature changed in ways she couldn't explain using physics. Lucian looked down at his book. You should go to bed. Mrs. Marsh needs someone to help in the kitchen early tomorrow morning. She stood up. Good night, Mr. Vexley. Lucian? She stopped. Just call me by my name. He didn't lift his head. Mr. Vexley is my father. Celine stood in the doorway for a second. Good night, Lucian. She stepped out and closed the door softly behind her, and had to walk down the hallway before her hand stopped touching the wall. On the 8th day, Marcus Hale came to find her, but not in the kitchen. She was in the small room next to her mother's when he knocked. He knocked twice, and without waiting for an answer, entered. Celine was sitting on the bed reviewing her internship notes. She looked up and immediately noticed something different about Marcus's expression than usual. Sit down, he said. I'm sitting. Good. He stood at the door, not stepping further inside. Someone asked about you last night. Celine put the notebook down. Who? Donatello Ferraro's man. She knew the name in a way that people shouldn't have. From the news, from stories that spread beyond the newspapers through rumors in public places. Ferraro was vying for shipping territory with Vexley in the Eastern Port area. She knew it because in the 8 days she'd lived in this house, she'd learned more than she intended. What did they ask? Ask her who she is. How long has she been here? What is her relationship with him? She looked at Marcus. Are they watching this house? They're always watching. His voice was emotionless. The difference is this time they're asking about a specific person by name. Celine felt something cold run down her spine. Not fear. Something sharper, more alert than fear. Does he know yet? I just told him. Marcus looked at her in a way that was neither judgmental nor sympathetic. I told you. Miss Vale. He said her name in the manner one uses when making a final decision. I don't know what he said to you in the library these past few nights. I didn't ask, but I need you to understand one thing. Go ahead and speak. Everyone who cares about him becomes his weakness. Marcus didn't look away. And his enemies don't attack his strengths. They attack his weaknesses. She met his gaze. You're telling me I should leave. I'm telling you the truth, and you decide for yourself. He walked out and closed the door. Celine sat quietly in her room, staring at the notes on her bed, and perceived the house around her in a different way. Not as a sanctuary, a chessboard, and she wasn't the player on it. She was a piece. Lucian came to see her that evening. He knocked on her door at 9 o'clock in the evening, which wasn't surprising since she had heard footsteps from afar. She opened the door, and he stood in the hallway in a dark coat, looking as if he had just come in from outside. The smell of the night and the cold air still clung to him. Come with me. Where to go? Library. She followed him without asking any further questions. In the library, the warm yellow light was brighter than usual. On the table were 2 glasses of water and a thin file. Lucian wasn't sitting. He stood by the window looking out at the dark garden. Marcus told her. Have. How are you feeling? She sat down in a chair. I feel like I need to know more than I already know. He turned to look at her. Specifically, what? What is the actual level of danger? Not the possibly kind of thing. It's more like, what percentage chance is it happening within a week? Lucian looked at her as if she were someone unfamiliar with being questioned in that manner. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down opposite her. He opened the file. It contained photographs, locations, and dates. Ferraro is losing shipping market share on the East Coast because of 3 bad decisions in a row over the last 6 months. When you lose market share, you need something else to trade for it, to prove you're still strong, to keep those below you from leaving. He pointed to a picture. The easiest thing is to put pressure on the competition indirectly. That means through the people surrounding the opponent. That is, through the people around your opponent, he confirmed, his voice flat as if he were lecturing. Your mother worked here for 13 years and was never noticed because she wasn't the focus of attention. You're not Mireia Vale. I am someone else. She's the woman Ferraro's team saw go in here 8 days ago and hasn't come out yet. Celine looked down at the photograph on the table. It was a high-angle shot from a distance. She recognized the mansion's main gate and the security team's car. There was a red pencil circle marking something at the edge of the photo that she had to look closely to realize was her own silhouette standing in the courtyard. Someone took a picture of her. How long ago? She asked, her voice remaining calm. 4 days. And he kept it from me for 4 days. I'm verifying the information before I speak. There was no apology in his voice, just the truth. She put the photo down. How much longer does my mother need to stay here? Miss Marsh said it could be another week before the bone is healed enough for comfortable movement. Where did she go after that? I've prepared an apartment, he said, as if it were a foregone conclusion. In another part of the city, safe. Celine looked at him for a moment. When did you prepare the apartment? Monday. She didn't know what to say about it. She looked back at the file, the photograph, the numbers, and the locations, evidence of a world she had decided to enter without knowing what the map looked like. You're talking to me as if I'm an insider. She looked him straight in the eye. But I'm not an insider. No. He didn't deny it. She's not. So why did you tell me all this instead of just saying the situation was more complicated and asking me to stay home until my mother was better? Lucian looked at her. The answer didn't come immediately. When it did, it came in the way people say things they've never said before. Because I'm not used to treating intelligent people as if they need to be protected from information. That sentence is dangerously simple. Celine picked up her glass of water and drank, wanting something to do with her hands. The room was silent except for the ticking of the antique clock in the corner. I applied to 3 hospitals, she said, before coming here. One of them might call back next week. I know. She paused. Excuse me? St. Vincent's Hospital, Presbyterian Medical, and New York General. He read out the names without looking at any papers. I checked the background of everyone who walks into this house. It's standard procedure. He checked my background. Have. Before or after the decision was made to let my mother stay here. Simultaneously, Celine set the glass down. You know more about me than I thought. Maybe. Then why do you still ask me why I'm studying nursing? A moment of silence. Then something that wasn't quite a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Because reading a resume and listening to someone speak for themselves are 2 different things. Celine couldn't sleep that night. She lay staring at the ceiling, piecing everything together in her head in chronological order. Diego, the hospital, this house, Marcus, Ferraro, the photograph of her silhouette at the gate, Lucian sitting on the library floor with his 2009 cardiovascular physiology textbook. All the pieces didn't fit together if she looked at it in the usual way, but they fit perfectly if she accepted that she was in an unusual situation. The problem is not dangerous. The problem is she's no longer sure she wants to leave for the right reasons, and that's what's scarier than all the others. On the 11th day, Garrett knocked on her door at 6 o'clock in the morning. Put on something warm. The bus arrives at 6:30. Where's the car going? He will explain. She got dressed and went down to the courtyard before 6:25. Lucian was standing there beside the dark blue car. Not the official car, no driver. He was standing behind the driver's seat and tossing the keys up once in his hand. Get in the car. Aren't you going to explain beforehand? Are not. She got into the car. They drove north out of the city, on the highway as the morning light began to shift the sky from charcoal blue to cool blue. Lucian drove in silence. Celine didn't ask. Outside the window, the city gradually gave way to trees and land. 40 minutes later, he pulled over in a small parking lot in front of the Community Health Center, a low-rise building with an old sign and frosted glass windows. What are you doing out here? She asked. They were short on nurses on Wednesday morning. He got out of the car. I said you could help. Celine looked at the building, then back at him through the car's roof. You didn't ask me first. No. He stood looking at her through the car window, the early morning light illuminating his face at an angle, revealing the small scar near his temple that she had noticed from the first day but hadn't asked about. Because I know your answer. She got out of the car. Inside the community health center were 14 patients waiting to be seen, elderly, mostly uninsured, living in an area where an ambulance takes an average of 27 minutes to arrive. The doctor on duty was a man named Reyes, about 50 years old, who looked at Celine as if she hadn't received help in a long time and wasn't sure she should believe in it. What year are you in school? My third year is almost over. What does she know how to do? Almost everything is done in the waiting room. Blood tests, vital signs checks, basic bandaging, and assistance when he needs a second hand. Reyes saw Lucian standing at the back of the room. He didn't recognize him, or perhaps didn't care, and that caught Celine's attention. This was a place where the Vexley name meant nothing. Okay, Reyes said. Let's start with patient number 3. The old lady in the corner, high blood pressure, afraid of needles. 3.5 hours later, Celine had completely forgotten that Lucian was sitting in the corner of the room. She recalled it when Reyes took a short break and she glanced across the room. Lucian was still there, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, reading an old magazine. But she realized he wasn't really reading. He was looking toward the corner of the room where she had just been sitting with an elderly patient, asking questions, checking, taking notes. Looking in the way someone sees something they recognize but have no name for. On the way back, as the afternoon sun began to turn red in the west, Lucian spoke for the first time since morning. She's good. Celine looked out the window. I'm still studying. It's not about technique, he paused. The old woman is afraid of needles. You sit down at her eye level and talk to her for 10 minutes before taking the blood. She doesn't realize when you insert the needle. Celine didn't answer immediately. My mother is afraid of needles, she said after a moment. I learned how to use them when I was 12. The car drove on for a while longer, and no one said anything. Then Lucian said, his voice changing in a subtle way that she noticed, I observed an operating room once in my first year, a skin graft. The patient had third-degree burns. The surgeon was the one who taught me anatomy. He looked straight ahead, his eyes on the road. I stood there for 2 hours and knew for sure this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. She didn't ask about the rest. It wasn't necessary. Do you regret it? She asked another question. A long silence, longer than usual. Every day. On the 13th day, Marcus Hale met Lucian in his office and closed the door. Celine walked down the hallway and listened, not intentionally, but she didn't stop when she heard her name. Ferraro is asking more about her, Marcus said, his voice flat and precise. Not for information, for her schedule. What does that mean? That wasn't a question from Lucian. The implication is they're no longer just curious, they're planning. Marcus paused. Lucian, I've worked with you for 12 years. I've never asked you about a personal decision. But this time, yes. This time, yes. Footsteps echoed in the room. Marcus paced, the kind of gait one uses when carefully choosing words. She's not one of us. Her mother is almost well enough to leave. This is the best time to finish things clean. Clean ending. She's gone. We've arranged discreet security for her mother at the new apartment. Ferraro has lost his target. That's it. Silence filled the room. Celine stood in the hallway, not breathing. He told me this, Lucian said slowly, because he thought I hadn't thought of it yet. I'm telling you this because I think you've thought about it and are choosing not to do it. Another moment of silence. Go away, Marcus. Footsteps. The sound of a door opening from the inside. Celine didn't have time to walk. Marcus stepped out and looked directly at her. The two looked at each other. Marcus wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. In his eyes, it was worse than both. The confirmation of someone who knew what was going to happen and that there was no way to stop it. He walked past her and down the hallway without saying another word. Celine stood in front of the closed office door and knew that two things were right at the same time. She should go, and she wouldn't. Not because she didn't know it was dangerous. Because for the first time in her life, she was standing in front of a door and wasn't sure whether she was standing on the outside or the inside. She knocked on the door. Enter. Celine walked into the office. Lucian was standing behind his desk, looking down at a piece of paper, his head not looking up. I heard it. He raised his head. Partially, she said. Enough to understand. Lucian watched her from behind his desk. The distance between them was 3 meters of room and 15 years of irreversible decisions. And in his eyes, there was something she recognized because she had seen it in the mirror enough times. A tired man. Not tired from lack of sleep, tired from doing for too long something they hadn't chosen. Celine, don't tell me Marcus is right. He stopped. Don't tell me I should go because it's the safer option. She took another step into the room. I know it's the safer option. I'm a nurse. I assess the risks every day. Then why? Because I don't want to leave before I understand why I want to stay, she said bluntly. not out of courage, but because she was too tired to beat around the bush. And I need to know what you want, not what you think is right, what you want. The room was silent. Lucian set the paper down. He walked around the table. He stepped in front of her, not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough for her to see in his eyes something he couldn't put into words, and something she wasn't sure he could put into words. I wanted... He paused. He started again. 15 years. I wanted nothing more than to keep things from falling apart. And now? His answer was cut short. Garrett's phone vibrated, not with a normal ringtone. The particular vibration she'd learned over 13 days was an emergency signal. Footsteps in the hallway, quick, making no attempt to muffle the sound. Garrett opened the door without knocking. There's someone at the gate. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were scanning the room and the two people inside. Tell them they have a message for Miss Vale. Lucian didn't look at her. He looked at Garrett. What kind of message? Video. Garrett placed the phone on the table. Send it to Maria's number. Celine walked to the table and looked down at the screen. The video was filmed from outside an apartment. She recognized it instantly. 4C, an apartment building in South Brooklyn. The person filming was standing in front of the door, and in the frame, through the small window pane, she saw the lights inside were still on. There was someone in her mother's old apartment, and in the bottom corner of the screen, a message appeared, tell her to go home. Or we'll find something else of Mrs. Vale's to send instead. Celine couldn't breathe for 2 seconds. Then she looked up at Lucian, and in his eyes she saw the answer to the question she had just asked. A question he hadn't had time to answer before Garrett entered. But that answer doesn't matter anymore, because in her mother's old apartment, someone was sitting in the shadows, waiting. And Celine Vale, who spent 3 years trying to escape South Brooklyn, who learned to gauge risk and make evidence-based decisions, who knows better than anyone where she stands and what the road ahead looks like. I'm holding my phone and I already know what I'm going to do. Celine put the phone down on the table. Not too hard, not too soft. Put it down as if you're trying to keep your hand from doing anything else for the next 3 seconds. Garrett stood in the doorway. Lucian stood less than a meter away from her. They were silent in 2 different ways. Garrett's silence of someone awaiting orders, Lucian's silence of someone working at high speed inside, ensuring nothing leaked out. Who's still in that apartment? Celine asked. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that only comes from having overcome panic and operating on something colder. Nobody, Lucian said. Your mother took all the necessary belongings on Wednesday. The apartment is still registered in my mother's name. Have. So they could use it as legal leverage if they wanted. She looked back at her phone screen, the text message still there. Or use it as evidence for anything they want to fabricate. Lucian looked at her in a way she had learned not of admiration, but of reassessment, as if he had just realized something about her that wasn't on her resume. Garrett! He didn't turn around. Get out! Garrett went outside and closed the door. Celine looked directly at Lucian. This isn't the first time they've done this. Are not. And how does he usually react? Usually there are no outsiders in this house for them to use as leverage. She heard what he didn't say. You're saying this is my fault. No. He looked her straight in the eyes. I'm saying this is my fault. I'm the one who decided to let you stay. The difference between those 2 sentences was both small and large at the same time. Celine looked at him and felt something in her chest want to believe the man standing before her, and that was precisely why she needed to keep a cool head. I need to know what they really want, she said. Not from me. They want from you. Lucian walked around the table, sat down in the chair, and looked up at the ceiling for a second before answering. The only thing she had ever seen him do when rearranging something truly complicated. Ferraro wants the Greenpoint shipping route. I control the only terminal that can handle refrigerated containers without customs declaration. He's wanted that route for 4 years now. Lucian placed his hand on the table, fingers extended. He used business pressure before. 3 months ago, he started using personal pressure. What was it like 3 months ago? One of my colleagues lost her young child in a car accident that wasn't actually an accident. Celine looked at him. Her stomach tightened. They killed a child. They sent a message. Lucian's voice was even, but something felt harder than usual between the 2 fingers resting on the table. And now they're sending another message. But this time, it has your name on it. The room was silent. Celine looked down at her phone again. The light in the old apartment framed the video, the light she grew up under, The pale yellow of cheap light bulbs her mother never changed because she didn't want to spend the money. For so many years, that light was the first thing she saw when she climbed the stairs after her mother's shift. Now someone was sitting under that light, waiting for her to do something stupid. "I'm not going back there," she said. "I know. But they also know I'm not going." She looked up. So what was the real purpose of the message? Lucian looked at her. In his eyes, for the first time in 13 days, there was something she could clearly read: anxiety. Not the kind of anxiety of someone who doesn't know what to do. The kind of anxiety of someone who knows exactly what to do and doesn't like the answer. "The goal was to make me move," he said. "When I move, I reveal my position. When I reveal my position, I create an opportunity. Set a trap. Have." Celine sat down in the chair opposite. "Then don't move." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Lucian looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he stood up, walked to the bookshelf in the back wall, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a file twice as thick as the one she had seen the day before. He placed it on the table in front of her. "Because there's more to it than just Ferraro." She opened the file. It took Celine 20 minutes to read through the file. Not the whole thing, but enough. Enough to understand that Donatello Ferraro wasn't the only one who wanted what Lucian Vexley possessed, and not the only one willing to use those around Lucian as tools to obtain it. It's easy to understand that she's gotten deeper into this situation than she thought from the very beginning. It's enough to understand that Marcus Hale was right, not about the conclusion, but about the fact. She closed the file. She looked up. Lucian stood by the window, his back to her, gazing out at the dark garden. "How long have you known it was this complicated?" "Always. And he still let me stay." He didn't answer immediately. His shoulders didn't move. "I've calculated that the increased risk is manageable." He miscalculated. "Yes." One word, no further explanation. Celine looked at the closed file. Names, numbers, locations, all written in blue ink on white paper in the neat style of someone who had done this work long enough to no longer have shaky hands. A world entirely parallel to the one she was learning to live in. And between those two worlds, the man stood by the window. "What do you need me to do?" she said. Not a question in the literal sense. It was the kind of question asked by someone who had already made up their mind and was moving towards taking practical action. Lucian turned around. He looked at her as if she had just said something he hadn't anticipated. "Nothing," he said firmly. "I need you to stay in this house, not go outside, for 72 hours. And then, after that, I dealt with the Ferraro issue, and she and her mother moved to a new apartment." Celine looked at him. "What does deal with mean?" "It means to process." "Lucian." She said his name for the first time out of a formal greeting, and it sounded different in her mouth than she expected. "I'm not an insider. But I'm not someone who needs to be shielded from information either. You said that yourself." He looked at her for 3 seconds. "That means he will no longer be a problem." Celine nodded. She didn't ask any further questions, not because she didn't want to know, but because she already knew enough to understand that some things, once spoken aloud, cannot be taken away. Celine didn't go back to her room right away that night. She sat in the small staff kitchen, drinking water and looking at the clock on the wall which showed 11:40, and tried to organize everything in her head in a manageable order. Her mother was asleep. She had gone in to check on her at 10 o'clock. Mireia was fast asleep, breathing evenly, her face showing the expression of someone who, for the first time in months, wasn't expecting something bad to happen in her sleep. At least that was still there. Stepping into the hallway. It wasn't Lucian. She had learned to tell the difference. This man walked faster, more irregularly. Marcus Hale walked into the kitchen, saw her, and stopped. "She's not asleep yet." He too. He poured some water, leaned against the kitchen counter, and looked at her as if he were considering whether or not to say something. He told her about Ferraro. "Have. And she's still here." "I was drinking water in the kitchen around midnight, Mr. Hale. I don't know what else here might mean." Marcus looked down at his glass of water. "You know what I'm most worried about isn't your safety, right?" She looked at him. "So what? It's him." Marcus's voice held no judgment, only the weariness of someone who had said this more times than it should. "I worked with Lucian Vexley for 12 years. I saw him make the coldest decisions a human being could make without losing a single night's sleep. I saw him end business relationships people had built up their whole lives with a single sentence, not because he was evil." He looked at her. Because he had nothing to lose. Celine remained silent. The person who has nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in any conflict, Marcus continued, because they have no fear, because they can push to a point that others can't. That's why Ferraro feared him. That's why everyone feared him. He paused. And now you're giving him something to lose. She didn't answer immediately. He talks as if it's a bad thing. Not for her, Marcus said, setting his glass down. For him, it's something that could kill him faster than any of Ferraro's bullets. He walked out. Celine sat alone in the kitchen, staring at her glass of water, and realized that Marcus Hale wasn't warning her to protect the house. He was warning her because he'd been there long enough to see what happened to the people Lucian Vexley had started to care about, and none of them were okay. The next morning, everything started normal until it stopped being normal. Celine ate breakfast with her mother in the small room, helping her with the breathing exercises she had designed to aid the faster healing of her ribs. Mireia didn't ask many questions. She never asked many, something Celine had always wanted to change in her mother, and never found a way to. They sat by the window overlooking the garden, drinking coffee, and for about 15 minutes Celine almost forgot everything outside of this small room. Almost. At 9:15, Garrett appeared at the door of the room with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as the professional expression of someone delivering bad news. Ms. Vale, you need to come to the office. Mireia looked at her. Celine placed her hand on her mother's shoulder for a second, said nothing, then stood up and followed Garrett. In the office, Lucian stood. Marcus stood. And there was a third person she had never seen before. A man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a brown suit, standing in the corner of the room with the air of someone who didn't belong in this house, but knew he had enough weight to stand anywhere. Lucian watched her as she walked in. There was something in his eyes that was different from all the times before. Sit down, Celine. She sat down. This is Harlan Voss, Lucian said, pointing to the man in the corner of the room. He works independently, and he just brought me something I need you to know about. Celine looked at Harlan Voss. He didn't look back at her immediately. He looked down at his hands, the kind of person who's making one last consideration to see if they've made the right decision. The message last night, Lucian began, wasn't from Ferraro. The room was silent. Celine heard that and needed a second for it to really settle. What? The phone number that sent the text message to your mother can be traced back to a prepaid number purchased at a convenience store in Queens 3 weeks ago. Lucian looked her straight in the eye. It's not linked to anyone in Ferraro's network. So whose is it? Marcus turned to look at Harlan Voss. He lifted his head. He looked at her for the first time since she entered the room. In his eyes was something she had learned in 3 years of nursing to recognize. Someone about to say something that would hurt. Ms. Vale, Voss said, his voice slightly hoarse, like that of a long-time smoker who had quit. I'm an informant. Independent, meaning I don't work for any one firm. 6 weeks ago, I was hired to gather information about the activities at this house. My employer wasn't Ferraro. She looked at him. Who? My employer, Voss said slowly, knows you very well. Knows your mother. Knows Mireia's schedule and her habits in this house. He paused. My employer knows that your mother won't be able to work that Thursday, and knows that you will be filling in for her. Celine felt something in her chest begin to beat out of rhythm. They knew beforehand. Have. Even before that happened to my mother. Voss stared at her without blinking. Yes, the recording studio. Not literally. In the sense of someone whose brain is trying to piece together the entire timeline of the past 3 weeks, and realizing that some things don't fit together in a way that should have been noticed sooner. Diego. She heard herself say that name. Diego Ramos. No one in the room confirmed or denied it. Someone used Diego. She didn't ask any more questions. She was thinking aloud. Someone knew he drank. Knew he was violent when drunk. Knew that if he did something bad enough that night, my mother wouldn't be able to go to work and I would have to go in his place. She looked at Lucian. And someone wanted me to come into this house. Lucian looked back at her. In his eyes was the answer he already knew before Voss arrived, and he was waiting to see if she would come on her own. She made it there. I'm not here by chance, she said, her voice flat, like someone who's just realized they're standing on different ground than they thought. I was brought here. Yes, Lucian said. For what purpose? That's something we haven't been able to identify yet. Celine stood up. Not out of anger. If she were angry, she would have stood up differently. She stood up because sitting made her feel like the walls were closing in, and she needed air to think. She went to the window, stood next to where Lucian usually stood, and looked out at the garden. The trees outside seemed completely oblivious to anything that was happening inside this room. Harlan, she asked without turning around. The man who hired you, do you know his name? I was paid through an intermediary account, Voss paused. But I have something else. The person who contacted me directly used a name. It could be fake, but that name has appeared in this house's records before. She turned around. Voss looked her straight in the eyes. Helena Marsh. The clock in the room continued to tick. Celine looked at Voss, at Marcus, at Lucian, who stood with both hands hanging down at his sides. And in his eyes was what she now recognized as the reaction of someone who had just received confirmation of something they had suspected but refused to believe. Mrs. Marsh, she said. Her voice sounded unfamiliar to me. How long has she worked here? Voss asked. 18 years, Marcus replied, his voice flat in the way people are when they don't allow themselves to feel anything. Since before Victor Vexley died. The room was eerily silent. Celine looked at Lucian. Did you know before Voss arrived? I suspected it last night, he said, looking directly back at her. When the message was sent to your mother's phone number. That number is known only to a select few in this house. And he didn't tell me. I need confirmation before I speak. That's the second time he's withheld information and explained it with that phrase. She didn't raise her voice. It wasn't necessary. I'm not your employee, Lucian, and I'm not someone who needs the kind of protection people give children. He didn't answer. She didn't know if it was because he didn't have an answer or because he was dealing with something more important at the moment. Where's Mrs. Marsh now? She turned to Marcus. Internal Affairs Office, ground floor. She's not going there, Lucian said immediately. I'm not going to hit her, Celine said, looking at him. I want to see the face of the man who used my mother as a pawn. That's what I need to do, she said, not in an argumentative tone, but in an informative one. And then I need you to answer a question that I really need an answer to. Lucian looked at her. He looked at Marcus. Marcus showed no expression. Garrett is going with her, Lucian said. Helena Marsh was sitting behind her desk when Celine walked in. Garrett was standing in the doorway. The 60-year-old woman lifted her head, looked at Celine, and not a single expression changed. That was the most terrifying thing of all. Not guilt, not embarrassment. The calmness of someone who had prepared for this moment. Miss Vale. Celine stood in the middle of the room, looking at her. How much did he pay you? There is no denial. There is no pretense of not understanding. More than 18 years working here, Marsh said, her voice not trembling at all. My mother worked for her for 13 years. Mireia does her job well. And she used her. Celine didn't back down, didn't move any closer. She stood still and spoke directly. She knew Diego Ramos drank. She knew he was violent. She arranged for him to be drunk enough that night. For the first time, something in Marsh's expression changed. Not regret. A subtle tension, the kind one feels when someone is told something they've been trying to bury. I didn't arrange for anyone to harm anyone. Her voice was firmer. No. She's just providing information to the person who will make the arrangements. Celine looked her straight in the eye. That's how people always keep their hands clean. Silent. Who does your grandmother work for? Celine asked. Marsh looked down at the table. He didn't answer. You don't have to answer me, Celine said, turning away. But you will answer Lucian, and I think we both know how different that conversation will be from this one. She stepped out. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for 10 seconds, feeling the cold tiles against her back, feeling the air in her lungs, regular, deliberate, the kind of breathing one practices to avoid being overwhelmed by emotions when the mind needs to be active. Garrett stood beside them, saying nothing. He'd learned that, knowing when people needed space and when they needed someone nearby. Who in this house can still be trusted? She asked, without opening her eyes. Besides him and me? Garrett thought carefully before answering. Marcus. 2 of the night shift security guards. The head chef. How many other people are unsure? I don't know, he said honestly. And that's the problem. She opened her eyes. Take me back to my office. Lucian was still standing in the same spot where she had entered. Marcus had sat down. Voss was no longer in the room. She didn't say her name, she reported briefly. But she didn't deny it. Lucian nodded. There was nothing on his face, but the way his jaw tensed, a technique she had learned, was the only way he let his emotions show. Your question, he said, from before you left. She sat down opposite him. Who knew my mother worked here? Not on the list. Who really knew? Knew enough to plan around her schedule? The answer to that question, Lucian said slowly, is shorter than you think. How many people? Besides the staff? He glanced down at the table for a second. 3. Name. Ferraro. The second opponent in the north is Callum Reed, and... He paused. She looked at him. She realized he was pausing at the most awkward moment. And the one who introduced your mother to my father 18 years ago. Lucian looked at her. Helena Marsh, she handled it. Marsh introduced my mother to his family. Have. From 18 years ago. Have. And now Marsh is the one who arranged for me to be here. She looked him straight in the eye. Lucian, this means my mother didn't just randomly start working here. He didn't answer. No need to reply. She looked at him and understood, not completely, but enough to realize that all 18 years, her mother in this house, Mrs. Marsh, Diego Ramos, the night she decided to come in her mother's place. It wasn't all a random series of chance encounters. Someone had placed these chess pieces down long before she even knew she was on the chessboard. Why? She said. Not asking why about everything. Asking the most specific, direct question. Why would anyone want me in this house? Lucian stood up. He walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of the room, opened it, and took out a thin envelope. He placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at the envelope. The name on it wasn't hers. It wasn't her mother's name. It was a name she had never heard before, but she needed to hear it spoken aloud to believe it was real. Victor Vexley. Supplementary material. October 2011. October 2011. The month Father Lucian was assassinated. Open it, Lucian said. She opened the envelope. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a legal document, confidential, stamped multiple times, in complex language, but she read quickly enough to grasp the gist. A witness protection agreement, signed in September 2011, the name of the protected person redacted. The second was a transcript of a phone call, short, 4 lines, between 2 people whose names were redacted, but the content was clear enough. Someone had reported Victor Vexley's location to someone else the night before he was killed. She picked up the third sheet of paper. No text. Only pictures. This is a low-quality black and white security camera shot from 2011. A woman is standing at the back gate of the mansion, talking to someone through the gate. The woman's face isn't directly in front of the camera, but it's tilted enough to be recognizable. Celine looked at the photo for 10 seconds. Then she placed it down on the table with completely calm hands, because that was the only thing she still had control over at this moment. The woman in the photograph, the one standing at the back gate of Vexley Manor the night before Victor Vexley's assassination, whose posture and figure were unmistakable even though her face wasn't directly in front of the camera, the woman she had seen every day for the 21 years of her life. There, Mireia Vale, her mother. And Lucian Vexley stood there, looking at her with the eyes of someone who had kept this photograph for 15 years and had just decided that she deserved to know the truth, or had run out of options to keep it any longer. She couldn't breathe. It wasn't because of the photo. It was because when she put it down and looked up at Lucian's face, she realized the final and worst thing. There was no cruelty in his eyes of someone using this information to attack her. There was something that looked very much like pain, the kind of pain of someone who has kept a secret too heavy for too long and now has to hand it over to someone else because there's no other way. How long? She heard herself say. Hoarser than usual. How long have you known? It's been around since 2014, Lucian said, when I found this security camera in the files my father kept. 3 years after his death. Have. And he did nothing. A moment of silence. I investigated. I found out why. Mireia wasn't the one giving the orders. She was being used, like Diego was being used, like you were being brought here. Someone knew she had information about my father's schedule and pressured her to share it. How do you force it? Lucian looked at her. By threatening you. This was the second filming session of the morning. Me. She heard her voice become low, in a way she couldn't control. How old was I in 2011? 8 years old. Celine Vale looked down at her hands. Both hands rested on her lap, calmly, in the automatic way of someone who had long learned to maintain an outward composure while everything inside was collapsing at an unstoppable pace. Someone threatened an 8-year-old child to force her mother to do something that would haunt her for the rest of her 21 years. And now that 8-year-old's daughter is sitting in the office of the son of the man who died because of what her mother was forced to do. And all the living in this story are being rearranged on a chessboard that someone planned long before anyone in this room knew they were playing. "My mother," she said, her voice now calm in a different way, the calm of someone who had passed the point of panic and was now on the other side. "Does she know I'm here?" "There's no reason to think she knew you were here for this reason. But she knows about the photo." "Perhaps." Lucian didn't pretend. "I don't know how much she knows about what's going on now." Celine stood up, slowly. She pressed her hands down on the table to straighten herself. "I need to talk to my mother." "Celine, not now." She looked at him. "And not with you in the room." Lucian looked at her. He looked long enough for her to know he was considering his options. Then he nodded. She stepped out. The hallway was longer than she remembered. She walked one step at a time, her hands not touching the walls, even though she wanted to, her back straight, even though everything inside her wanted to bend over. She counted her steps to stop thinking. 14 steps to the corner of the hallway. Turn right. 8 more steps. Her mother's room door. She stopped in front of the door. Place your hand on the wooden surface. Inside, her mother was sitting by the window, drinking her morning coffee, perhaps looking out at the garden, which, for the first time in years, she could truly see without worrying about the sound of footsteps on the wooden deck. And Celine Vale stood at the door and realized she didn't know whether she was entering as her daughter or carrying something that would shatter the only brief moment of peace Maria Vale had enjoyed in 21 years. And from the office behind him, Lucian's phone rang, once, twice, then stopped. Then came Garrett's quick footsteps down the hallway. Then Marcus's voice, low and strained, came from the staircase. "They've made it through the east gate." Celine turned around. Garrett was running toward her, and on his face was something she hadn't seen in the man for the past 14 days. Not fear. Something sharper than fear. Something that one might sometimes be afraid of, replaced by a situation too specific to leave room for emotion. "Miss Vale." He stopped in front of her. "They didn't come because of him." She looked at him. "They came because of her." And from the ground floor below, the sound of shattering glass echoed, sharp, clear, unmistakable. And Celine Vale stood before her mother's bedroom door, in the house of a man she never intended to meet, with 15 years of secrets placed in her hands, and yet to be fully revealed. And she understood that from this moment on, everything she had was no longer enough. The sound of shattering glass came a second time, this time from a different direction, the west wing, and it wasn't a window, louder, heavier, the kind of sound of something designed to break, not to shatter by accident. Garrett grabbed Celine's arm. "Go." "My mother." "I know." He opened Maria's door before Celine could move. Stepping inside, he saw Maria rising from her chair, her face pale, and uttered 3 words in a manner that left no time for any other reaction. "Follow me, now." Maria Vale didn't ask. 18 years in this house had taught her that. When the Vexley men spoke, don't ask, don't take anything else, just get up and leave. They moved down the second-floor hallway in order, Garrett first, Celine holding her mother's hand in the middle. And at the end of the hallway, Marcus was waiting with 2 members of the day shift security team that Garrett had called earlier, but Celine hadn't heard at all. "The basement," Marcus said briefly. "The north exit." "Lucian?" Celine asked. "The ground floor." Marcus looked at her as if it wasn't the time for a lengthy explanation. "He's dealing with the east gate." "Alone?" "Never be alone." He started walking. "Move." They descended the side staircase. Not the main staircase with its dark wooden railings that Celine was familiar with, but a narrow staff staircase with concrete walls and cold white fluorescent lights. The sound of 5 people's footsteps echoed unmistakably, and Celine understood why Marcus hadn't tried to hide it. Speed was more important than silence at this moment. First floor. Gunshots rang out from the east wing of the building. Mireia let out a small sound, a breath cut short. Celine tightened her grip on her and continued walking, without stopping, without turning back to look in the direction of the gunshot, even though every instinct within her was pulling her towards it. The basement staircase. Garrett opened the door with a key card. He had to swipe it twice because the first time it didn't read. And in those 2 seconds, Celine heard footsteps on the first floor above her head. Not familiar footsteps. Not the rhythm of someone who had lived in this house. The door is open. They got off. The basement of the Vexley mansion wasn't the kind you see in movies. No candlelight, no damp walls. It was a spacious room with white LED lighting, a dry concrete floor, a row of metal cabinets along the left wall, and on the right a steel door that Celine had never seen in her 2 weeks there. Marcus walked straight to that door. This way leads to the underground parking lot. From there, it's a side street to the north. A car? Garrett asked. I've called. Marcus looked at his watch. 4 minutes. Celine looked at the door, then at her mother, Mireia, standing with one hand still clutching her side habitually, even though her bone had healed somewhat. Her face was pale, but her eyes showed no panic. It was the look of someone accustomed to enduring something greater than herself, with no other choice but to continue standing. That look, in that moment, tore something in Celine's chest, not because she was afraid, but because she looked familiar with it. So familiar that it no longer surprised her. And Celine realized that this wasn't the first time Mireia Vale had stood in the basement of this mansion waiting for danger to pass. This isn't the first time. From above, the sound of running footsteps. Someone shouted, a short, cut-off scream. Then came a silence heavier than the sound of gunfire. Garrett looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his watch. 2 minutes. Celine turned to her mother. Mom, she said softly. Have you ever been here before? Mireia didn't answer immediately. She looked towards the steel door. Mom. She didn't let go of her mother's hand, but turned to look her straight in the face. This isn't the time to lie. 1 second, 2 seconds. Once, Mireia said. Her voice was hoarse and low. In 2011, Celine looked at her mother. She looked at her hand holding hers. She felt the 15 years of secrets suspended in the air between them. I know, she said. 2 words. Nothing more. Mireia Vale looked up at her daughter. In her eyes was something Celine had seen a couple of times in her life, and each time she didn't know how to name it. Not fear, not regret. Something deeper than both. Something one has when they've lived with a secret long enough for it to become a part of their being, and someone has just touched it. With the steel door swung open from the outside. Garrett raised his gun immediately. Marcus took a step back, pulling Mireia behind him. Celine didn't move. She stood still and stared into the darkness of the underground passage behind the door, where a figure stepped in under the light. Not one of Ferraro's men. It's Lucian. His left shoulder was torn. There was blood on the back of his right hand, not much, but fresh. His face showed no sign of pain, but the way he held his left arm close to his body was something Celine could read immediately. She walked toward him before her brain could even process the command. Stay still. She raised her hand. Let me see. No problem. I'm a nurse. She didn't let him finish the sentence. Stay still. Lucian stood still. She pulled up her torn sleeve. The wound was in her upper arm, about 5 centimeters long, not deep enough to reach the bone, but bleeding steadily, the kind that wouldn't stop on its own in 20 minutes without a bandage. She looked around, glancing toward the metal cabinet on the wall. Marcus, does that cabinet have a first aid kit? The third cabinet. She went to get it, opened it. A standard first aid kit, everything she needed. She grabbed a bandage to stop the bleeding and returned to Lucian in 15 seconds. Put your hand on my shoulder. He complied. She pressed the bandage against the wound, holding it tight, feeling his breath change rhythm for half a second as the pressure touched the wound, then stabilize again. She bandaged quickly, not neatly, but firmly enough to stop the bleeding until proper treatment was possible. How many people are at the East Gate? Garrett asked. 7, Lucian replied, his eyes glancing down at the top of Celine's head as she bent down to bandage him. 3 more. Our team is holding them. The main objective? It wasn't me, Lucian said, and Celine felt the muscles in his arm tense under her hand. It never was me. She looked up at him. He looked back. In his eyes was the same thing she had first seen in the library when she placed Cornell's report card on the table in front of him. A man staring straight at something they didn't want to acknowledge and doing it nonetheless. They came because of you, he said, his voice low enough only for her to hear. And now I know why. She didn't ask. She waited. Harlan Voss, he said. The person who hired Voss wasn't Marsh. Marsh contacted Voss. She's the middleman, The real mastermind behind it all is the one who hired Marsh as a middleman and hired Marsh 18 years ago. Lucian looked at her. The one who knew in 2011 that Mireya Vale would become the house's weak point. The one who planned to use her, and you, before any of us even met. Eat. Callum Reed. She remembered the name, since this morning, in the office, the third person on the short list who knew her mother's work schedule. His northern rival, Old. Lucian's voice changed subtly. Callum Reed was my father's rival before he was mine. The one who wanted that shipping route even before my father built it. And the one who used your mother to... He stopped. To kill his father, Celine said instead. Lucian didn't confirm it verbally. No need. So Ferraro, she said, is the smoke screen. Reed is using Ferraro as pressure from the south while he moves from the north, Lucian said, looking toward the exit. And he wants you here because he knows your presence will distract me. And it distracted him. Yes. He wasn't pretending, but not in the way Reed predicted. Gunfire from above, a burst, then a pause, then complete silence, the kind of silence that follows something ending, not the silence of something waiting to begin. Garrett listened through his headphones and nodded. The east gate is clean, Marcus sighed. And the west? No report yet. Lucian looked at Garrett. Take them to the car. I'm going west. No, Celine said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She didn't look back at them. She looked at Lucian. He just had a bandage applied. That wound needs at least 20 minutes of pressure before he can use his left hand normally. If he moves and uses force now, the bandage will come loose, and he'll lose enough blood to slow his reflexes. I know my limits. He knew his limits back in 2011 when he was studying surgery. Now he's operating with one arm, and the adrenaline is down. She looked him straight in the eye. Garrett went west. He's here. For a second. Lucian looked at her as if he were someone unaccustomed to being stopped by reason and processing that feeling. Then he nodded. Garrett and the two guards moved up the stairs. Marcus stopped, looked at Lucian, looked at Celine, and in his eyes was something she didn't have time to analyze. Mireya Vale stood in the corner and looked at everyone in the room. Her daughter, the man she had worked for 13 years. The man she had unwittingly helped to kill his father 15 years earlier, and on her face was something that Celine, for that one moment only, saw fully for the first time in her life. The self-punishment of someone who had lived with a mistake long enough for that mistake to become what defined them. Lucian. Mireya's voice. It was the first time she'd spoken in this basement. He turned to look at her. I know you already know, she said slowly and clearly, her eyes not looking away. I've been waiting for the day you'd face me ever since you came to power. You don't owe me an explanation, Lucian said flatly. No. Mireya shook her head. But I owe you the truth. That year they came to my house. They had photos of my child going to school. They said if I didn't... She stopped, looked down. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. I only confirmed the schedule. I didn't know what they would do with that information. She knows, Lucian said, not maliciously, just truthfully. She just doesn't know to what extent. Mireya did not deny it. The silence in the room lasted long enough for Celine to hear the basement ventilation system and the sound of her hands tightening their grip on the first aid kit she was holding. Where's Callum Reed now? She asked, not to anyone in particular. She was asking the room. Marcus replied, He's not in New York. Never been here in person. That's how he operates, always far enough away to have a justification. But the people he sent are here. Have. And when they don't finish the job, Celine said slowly, he'll send someone else. That's how he's operated for 15 years, Lucian confirmed. She set the first aid kit down on the cabinet. She looked at her hands. They weren't trembling, just slightly cold. The kind of cold your body feels when blood is being diverted to vital organs and withdrawn from the periphery. A survival reflex. Your body is preparing for something your mind hasn't yet decided on. I need you to tell me the truth about something, she said to Lucian. Go ahead and ask. If I leave here right now, my mother and I, to the new apartment he's prepared, Reed won't stop. Lucian looked at her. The answer was in his eyes before his mouth spoke, and she read it before she heard it. Are not. Because I've been here long enough. Because he invested so much in bringing you here only to have you relocated, Lucian said bluntly. You know too much now. Not about me, about him, about Marsh, about the timeline. He can't let you go free with that information. Celine nodded, once, slowly. She turned to her mother. Mom, go with Marcus. The car is waiting outside the underground passageway. Celine, Mom's leaving. She walked over and hugged her mother for a second. Not the long farewell hug, but the kind of hug that conveys something tangible through physical contact. Then she stepped out. Marcus, take her away immediately. Marcus looked at Lucian. Lucian nodded. Marcus placed his hand on Mireya's shoulder and led her toward the steel door. Mireya turned to look at her daughter one last time, a long, heavy gaze containing 15 years of unspoken words. Then she turned and walked through the door. The steel door closed. Only Celine and Lucian remained in the basement. He looked at her. You won't be going with them. Are not. Why? She looked him straight in the eye. Because you need a second hand, and your left hand isn't functioning properly. That's not the real reason. That's one real reason. She walked toward the stairs. The rest isn't the time to talk about. The ground floor of Vexley Manor looked completely different from the house Celine had lived in for 2 weeks. The west-facing window pane was shattered. Not just a pane, but the entire large frame, shards of glass lying on the marble floor in an inverted pattern. The armchair was pushed askew. On the wall near the entrance, a dark streak ran down in a pattern Celine didn't look at further because she knew what it was. Garrett stood at the west door, headphones on his head, having a brief conversation with someone on the other end of the line. He saw Lucian and Celine emerge from the corridor, and there was a questioning look in his eyes about her presence, but he didn't ask. Garrett had long since learned which battles were worth fighting. The West is clean, he reported, but we have a problem. Speak, Lucian said. Those 3 got inside before our team could react. Garrett paused. They took something from the second floor before retreating. What? His office. Garrett looked directly at Lucian. The filing cabinet in the right corner. Celine noticed Lucian's jaw tighten. He said nothing for 2 seconds. A brown envelope, he said afterward. Not a question. It seems so. She looked at Lucian. Which envelope? He looked back at her. In his eyes was something she was beginning to recognize as the look he had when the situation had escalated to a point where he was no longer entirely in control. The only remaining evidence of what Callum Reed did in 2011, he said, the original phone records, the original security camera footage, and the real name of the contact Reed used to reach her mother. They took everything. The original. He looked toward the staircase leading to the second floor. I keep the copy elsewhere. Where? It's safe. He began walking towards the stairs. But we need it before Reed knows the copy exists. She followed. Garrett followed her. The second floor was quiet, like the aftermath of a storm. Everything was in its place, but the atmosphere had changed. Lucian's office door was wide open. Inside, the filing cabinet in the right corner was pried open, the top drawer empty. Everything else was untouched. This man knew exactly what he was looking for. Lucian went straight to the bookshelf, took down a thick book, Advanced Physiology, published in 2008, a copy she hadn't seen before because it was on the top shelf. She opened it. Inside weren't pages, but a hollowed-out compartment, and within it was a small USB drive and an envelope thinner than the one in the filing cabinet. He took both out and put them in his inner jacket pocket. Is everyone here? That's enough to finish Reed off. He closed the book. If we get where we need to go. Anywhere. Before Lucian could answer, Garrett's earpiece emitted a sound. He listened, his expression changing in a subtle way. But Celine had learned enough to read it. Not good news, not the usual bad news. The kind of news you hear and need a second to process before speaking. Garrett. Lucian looked at him. Marcus just called. Garrett looked at Lucian, then at Celine. The car is blocked on the north side road. They're holding Mireya. The room was silent. Celine heard the sound of blood pounding in her ears. They're not attacking the vehicle, Garrett continued. They're holding their position and requesting communication. What do you want? Lucian's voice was dangerously flat. I'm asking for Ms. Vale, Garrett said, looking at Celine. And all the evidence you have. She felt a chill spread from her spine to her skin. Not fear. Something colder than fear, the kind that comes when you realize you've reached a point where all paths are bad, and you have to choose the least bad one. Lucian looked at her. She looked back at him. No, he said, before she could open her mouth. He didn't hear what I said. I don't need to hear it. His voice was flat, but something beneath the surface was anything but flat. The answer is no. That's not your decision. She took a step towards him. That's my mother's decision. And if I hand you over, you won't come back. He didn't raise his voice. No need. The truth doesn't need volume to sound heavy. Reed left no witnesses. I know. Then, I know, Lucian, she said slowly and clearly, looking him straight in the eye. I'm not offering myself as a deal. I'm offering to use what they want to buy time. He looked at her. Explain. They want me in proof. If they have both right now, there's nothing left to bargain with. But if I go there on my own, not because of pressure, but because of my own choice, and with conditions, then I'm the one controlling the conditions of contact, not them. That's the theory. That's leverage. She didn't look away. They need me alive to get the evidence from him. As long as I'm alive and within their sight, my mother is safe. And in the meantime, he has plenty of time to make his move. The room was silent. Garrett looked at the floor. Not because he lacked an opinion, because he knew this wasn't a conversation where his opinion mattered most. Lucian looked at her long enough for her to feel the weight of his gaze, not evaluating a plan. Evaluating something else, something she wasn't sure he had a name for. If I agree, he said finally, his voice lower than usual, you understand I won't leave you there alone. I know. And she understood what that meant. I know what that means, she interrupted, not rudely, just confidently. I learned risk assessment before I could read, and I'm assessing risk now. What was your assessment? She looked at him. In his office, with the filing cabinet pried open in the corner and the late afternoon light streaming through the window without curtains, the curtains having been pulled down while the Western security team was inspecting the room, in all the practical chaos of the situation, Selina Vale made her decision not by emotion and not by pure reason, but by something in between, something one only acquires after having lived long enough with both. My assessment is that we have no better options within the next 20 minutes. She turned to Garrett. Call Marcus back, tell them I'm coming, and tell them I'm coming on my terms. What are the conditions? Garrett asked. My mother was released before I got out of the car. Garrett looked at Lucian. Lucian nodded once, without looking away. Garrett went outside to make a phone call. There were only 2 people left in the room. Lucian walked to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and took something out. He straightened up and held it in his right hand. A small black device, smaller than his thumb. Location tracking. He stepped closer to her. If you carry it, I'll know where you are at any given time. She looked at the device in his hand. What's the range? Far enough. She held out her hand. He placed the device in her palm, his fingers touching her palm for a moment shorter than a blink of an eye, and longer than all the previous accidental touches combined. She closed her hands. Lucian. She looked at him one last time before leaving. The question from this morning, the one I asked and you didn't get a chance to answer. He knew which question she was referring to. I wanted something I didn't know I was allowed to want, he said. His voice wasn't flat this time, not entirely. And I wanted it before I knew I wanted it. Selina Vale gazed at him for a second shorter than all the other seconds of that day combined. Then she walked out. A black car is waiting in the front yard. It wasn't Lucian's car. A neutral vehicle, rented, with clean license plates, no indication of belonging to either side. This was the condition Selina had told Garrett. She arrived in a vehicle unrelated to Vexley, unarmed, and without visible bodyguards. Visible is the key word. She sat in the back seat. The driver was someone she'd never met, one of Garrett's independent contacts, someone who didn't ask and didn't need to know. He just drove. The Vexley mansion is miniaturized in the rear window of the car. She opened her palm and looked at the small black tracking device. She placed it in her inner jacket pocket, where it wouldn't be found during any preliminary search anyone from Reed's team would conduct. Then she sat up straight, placed her hands on her thighs, and closed her eyes for 3 breaths, not to calm down, to take inventory. What she knew, Reed was somewhere other than New York, but his men were here. They wanted the evidence Lucian was holding. They were using her mother as leverage because that was the most effective way to manipulate her. They needed her alive because if she died, she wouldn't be able to convince Lucian to hand over anything. Things she didn't know, how many people were waiting, what their plans were after getting what they wanted, and what Maria Vale's physical condition was like after being held in the car on the northern side road. She opened her eyes. The north side road appeared through the front window, narrow, unlit, with trees on either side casting shadows onto the asphalt, creating a dark corridor. And at the end of that corridor, she saw car lights, 2 cars, parked across the road. Her car stopped. "Here it is," the driver said. Celine looked through the rearview mirror. The distance between her car and the 2 cars blocking the road was about 50 meters. In the middle, in the headlights, she saw figures, 3 standing and 1 sitting on the ground leaning against the wheel, being supported by Marcus standing next to them. Her mother. She placed her hand on the doorknob. The phone in my pocket vibrated, once, briefly. The message had no sender's name, just 2 words, 4 minutes. She knew what that meant. She opened the car door and stepped out. The cold night wind, the smell of asphalt and trees, the headlights of 2 oncoming cars shining directly into her face, enough to make her close one eye as she walked. 50 meters. 40. She walked steadily, neither hurrying nor slowing down. The speed of someone moving intentionally, not the speed of someone being pushed. 30 meters. The man in the middle walked toward her, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothing. She didn't recognize his face, but she recognized his posture, the kind of posture of someone accustomed to standing between 2 people and being looked at for answers. "Miss Vale." "Release my mother." He looked at her. "Proof first." "That wasn't my condition." She stopped, 15 meters away from him. "My condition was that my mother be released before I got out of my car. I got out. Now release her." The silence was long enough for her to count 5 heartbeats. Then the man turned his head and said something briefly to the person standing next to the car on the left. That person walked towards her mother, spoke to Marcus, and Marcus helped Maria stand up. She exhaled. "Mom, walk toward my car," she said loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Don't stop. Don't look back." Maria Vale looked up at her daughter from a distance of 30 meters. She couldn't read her mother's face in the headlights, but she saw her stand up, not quickly, not easily, but upright, and begin to walk. She walked through the space between the 2 groups of people. She walked past where Celine was standing without stopping, even though both knew this was the moment they should have stopped, should have said something, should have touched each other. Maria walked past because Celine had told her not to stop, and Maria Vale had learned in a lifetime that when her daughter spoke in that tone, she listened. She heard her mother's footsteps behind her, further away. To the car. The sound of the car door closing. She turned to look at the man in front of her. "My condition is met," she said. "Now." "Now," he said. "Call Vexley and tell him to bring the evidence here." She looked at him. At the 2 people standing on either side. At the 2 cars blocking the road. A quick calculation. Not the probability of winning in this situation. The probability of prolonging the situation long enough. Then she heard what the man in front of her had also heard. A noise from behind the 2 cars blocking the road. Not loud, just loud enough for both of them to know that something was changing on that side, something they couldn't see. The man turned his head for a second, just 1 second, and in that moment, Celine Vale, who had learned to read rooms at the age of 7, who had learned to assess situations in 3 years of nursing, who had lived 14 days in Lucien Vexley's house and learned that precise time was not something to wait for, but something to be done. That second lasted in the way that truly important seconds usually last. Not longer in duration, but thicker in what it contained. The man turned his head towards the sound behind the 2 cars. Celine didn't wait any longer. She didn't run. Running was the goal of movement, and she was standing in the middle of nowhere to run to. Instead, she did what 3 years of nursing had taught her in emergency situations where space was tight and there weren't enough people. She moved toward the nearest car on the left, in the shortest straight line, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground in front of her. The person standing next to the car on the left reacted about half a second slower than her. Half a second is enough. She shoved him in the hip with her shoulder, not the shove of a trained fighter, but the shove of someone shifting their center of gravity forward with no intention of stopping. He lost his balance, recoiled into the car, and Celine was on the other side before he hit the car's hood. Behind the 2 cars, in the shadows of the side road, it wasn't complete darkness anymore. Lucien stood there. She wasn't alone. Garrett was to her right, and 2 others she recognized as the day shift security guards were behind them. But she looked at Lucien first, and only at him for the first moment, because he was looking at her the way one looks after 3 minutes of not knowing what was happening on the other side, and being unable to do anything but stand and wait. 4 minutes. A 2-word message as she got out of the car. He had come from the other direction, across the field to the left of the side road, while she was walking toward the two cars blocking the way. That's what she knew when she read the message. Not a promise, not reassurance. An announcement of the time. "Are you all right?" he said, his voice flat, but those two words came out of his mouth faster than anything else he'd said that day. "Okay." She looked over his shoulder. Behind the car, Garrett and the security team were handling the situation. Footsteps, brief voices, no more gunfire. "My mother?" "We're on our way to a safe location. Marcus is coming with us." She exhaled. Not a sigh of relief, the sigh of someone who had run far enough for their body to remind them that it was also participating in the race. Lucian looked at her for another second, in a way that seemed to examine her. Not the wound, but something more difficult to define. Then he turned and walked toward Garrett. She stood alone in the shadows behind the two cars, listening to the wind rustling through the trees on either side of the road and the distant voice of her neighbor on the main street, and feeling the small tracking device in her inner jacket pocket still warm from her body heat. That night did not end in triumph. It ended with a small room at the secure transit station that Garrett had prepared. Not in Vexley Manor, since the manor had been breached and needed time to reassess security, but a different, clean location, unknown to anyone except the three of them. The room had enough chairs and sufficient lighting, and a more complete first aid kit than the last time. Celine sat on a chair and properly bandaged Lucian's wound. Not a makeshift bandage like in the basement, but following the correct procedure, cleaning the wound, stitching two small sutures at the deepest part of the tear, and securing it with a bandage. He sat still the whole time, not looking at her hands as she worked. He stared at the opposite wall, as if he were more in his own head than in the room. "Voss," she said as she tied the final knot of the ribbon. "Where is he now?" "Safe." Lucian offered no further explanation. He delivered what was necessary. "Is that enough to take Reed to court?" "Enough to bring Reed to court." He paused. "And enough to answer some questions about 2011 that I've had, but never had complete answers to." She finished tying it. She lowered her hand. She sat up straight and looked at the white bandage on his left arm. Neat, secure, not perfect by hospital standards, but good enough for the current condition. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "The evidence. One copy went to the federal prosecutor I contacted 2 years ago. The other went to the newspaper, to the right person." He looked down at his bandaged arm. "I don't want to treat Reed the old way." "The old way. The way my father taught me." His voice changed subtly as he said it, not softer, more honest. "The way I've used it for 15 years now, and I know that each time I use it, the person I was at Cornell takes another step forward." She said nothing. She waited. "I want him convicted in court, recorded, known by name for what he did." He looked up. "Not to disappear the way people disappear in my world, where no one asks any further questions." Celine looked at him. In the white light of this small room, devoid of the golden glow of the library or the shadows of the basement, just the ordinary light of a place not designed to look beautiful, Lucian Vexley looked different than ever before. It wasn't because of the injury. It wasn't because of the clothing or the circumstances. Because he's saying what he really wants to say and not hiding it the way he's been hiding everything else. "That was a harder decision than the other one," she said. "I know. The court process takes time. Reed's lawyers will fight it step by step. It could take years." "I know. And during that time he must remain in the position he is currently in." "Not exactly." He looked down at his hands. His right hand, unharmed, fingers stretched out on his thigh. "This evidence also includes documentation of my own network. Things I've been slowly gathering over the past 3 years to prepare for the day I decide to step out of it in a way that won't kill me immediately." She remained silent. "I had prepared for this before you even entered that house," he said. "Before I knew you existed. You are not the reason I decided to do this." "But," she said, because she heard that word waiting at the end of his sentence. "But you're the reason I decided to do this now, instead of waiting until next year, or the year after that, or until I find a better reason to keep procrastinating." He looked at her. "You asked me what I want. I want to be the person I knew I could be before all this happened, and I'm tired of it feeling like it's impossible." The room was silent except for the hum of the heating system. Celine looked at him long enough to see that he didn't look away, even though they both knew this was the kind of moment when people usually look away. "Does Cornell have a program for people who have dropped out?" she asked. He looked at her. He didn't immediately understand where the question was headed. Have you asked yet? Not yet? Then ask. 3 days later, Celine sat in her mother's small apartment in the Astoria district. The apartment Lucian had prepared, fourth floor, windows overlooking an ordinary street with maple trees and a bakery on the corner and the sound of a bus passing by every 20 minutes. The apartment wasn't luxurious and didn't try to be. It was simply clean, bright, and had a good lock on the front door. Mireya Vale sat opposite her daughter on the new sofa Celine had bought with her yesterday from the furniture store 4 blocks away. Between them was a small coffee table with 2 cups of tea and the space that had waited 3 days to be filled with things that needed to be said. Mireya began. Not because she was ready, because she hadn't been ready for 15 years and had learned that readiness isn't something that comes in order, but something that must be chosen. 2011, she said. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm someone who had said those words in their head 1,000 times. September. A man came to your school. Not inside. He stood outside the fence. He took pictures of you. Then he came looking for Mom. Celine held the teacup in both hands. She didn't drink. She just held it. He told Mother that he knew she worked at Mr. Vexley's house. He knew she overheard certain conversations. He knew she saw certain people going in and out. Mireya looked down at her hands. He wanted Mother to confirm Victor Vexley's schedule for the following day. That's all, he said. Just tell him where and when he'll be. And he showed Mom a picture of me. Yes. Mireya's voice didn't break. She'd cried about this enough times in 15 years that there were no more tears left for it, only the dry, heavy truth. He said if Mom didn't do it, I wouldn't get to school safely the next day. He didn't elaborate. No need to elaborate. Celine set her teacup down. Did Mom know he would use that information to harm Victor? Mireya was silent for a moment. I knew that information would be used for something bad. I didn't know exactly what. She looked up. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. I know. Mother has lived with that ever since. Mireya's voice lowered. Every day she walked into that house, working for the son of the man she helped others kill. Not directly, not intentionally. She knew. She always knew. Why don't you quit your job? Because if I left, he would know that Mother regrets it. And the one who regrets it is the one who can talk. Mireya looked straight into her daughter's eyes. And because Lucian Vexley, from the age of 23 when he took over everything, never treated Mother in a way that would make her feel like she was being punished, she didn't know if he knew, until you told her that he did. Celine looked at her mother, the woman who had carried this burden alone for 15 years in apartment 4C in South Brooklyn, in the shadow of Diego Ramos and beneath a layer of secrecy heavier than anything Diego had ever placed upon her. She looked and realized that all the things she thought she understood about her mother, her silence, her suffering, the way she never explained any of her choices, all of them were both true and insufficient at the same time. Mom should have told me, Celine said. I should. Mireya didn't deny it. But each year that passes is another year I don't know how to begin. And each year you get stronger, farther, better. I'm afraid if I say it, you'll see me differently. Mom is afraid you won't forgive her. No. Mireya shook her head. I'm afraid you'll forgive me, and that would be easier than what I deserve. The sentence landed between the two of them like a real, heavy object. Celine looked at her mother. She looked at the hand resting on her lap, the hand that had mopped other people's floors for 23 years, the hand that had held hers in the hospital when she had a high fever at age 6, the hand that had signed the loan agreement so she could go to Albany to study nursing without knowing how many years it would take to repay the money. She placed her hand on her mother's hand. He said nothing immediately. Not because he had nothing to say, but because what needed to be said wasn't something that could be expressed in words at the first moment. That man, she said after a moment. The one who came to school in 2011. Do you know his name, Mom? No, but Mom remembers your face. Someone's coming to see you, Mom, from the prosecutor's office. She looked straight into her mother's eyes. You'll have to tell them everything you just told me. Mireya didn't reply immediately. Do you know what that means, Mom? Her voice was calm but not cold. There could be legal consequences for you. I don't know the extent. I'm not a lawyer. But Lucian's people will arrange a lawyer for you before you meet with the prosecutor. It's Lucian's. Mireya looked at her daughter. I trust him. It's not a question, but it needs an answer. Yes, Celine said. No further explanation. One word heavy enough in its own right. Mireya Vale looked at her daughter for a moment, looking in the way a mother looks at her grown-up child, a way that she recognizes but cannot describe. Then she nodded. Once. Slowly. Okay. Callum Reid was arrested on Tuesday morning of the following week, not in New York, in Montreal, where he had been for 7 weeks and thought he was far enough away to avoid being found by anything from the South. The FBI, in coordination with the RCMP, executed the arrest warrant at 6 a.m. while he was having breakfast in his luxury apartment overlooking the St. Lawrence River. Celine read the news on her phone in her nursing dorm room. She had returned to Albany 2 days earlier to finish up the paperwork for her final internship. She read the news, put the phone down on the table, and sat still for about 30 seconds staring at the wall. Then she grabbed her coat and went to her morning shift. The work didn't change because the news on the phone changed. Patients still needed someone to take their blood pressure and draw blood and sit down at eye level to talk before the needle was inserted. She still did all of that with the same hand on the same day that Callum Reid was sitting in the interrogation room in Montreal, and beginning to understand that his 15 years of planning had just collapsed because of a file kept in a physiology textbook on the top shelf of the library in the house he had tried to break into. Helena Marsh resigned from her position as head of internal affairs on the same day via email sent to Marcus Hale's inbox. No explanation, no apology, just 2 lines of announcement and a signature. Marcus read the email, deleted it, and began interviewing the replacement that afternoon. 2 weeks after Callum Reid's arrest, Celine received the results from St. Vincent Medical Center. She read the letter in the kitchen of her mother's apartment in Astoria. Mireya was napping in her room, the faint sound of the television coming through the slightly ajar door. The November sun shone through the kitchen window, a thin, golden late autumn sun, not warm enough but bright enough. She finished reading. She put the phone down on the kitchen counter. She looked out the window. Trauma nursing, night shift, starting in January. Exactly what she wanted, the exact hospital she wanted, the exact department she studied for 3 years to work in. She picked up the phone and dialed a number. The other end answered after 2 rings. I just received a letter from St. Vincent, she said. I know, Lucian said. The head of department is someone I know. She said you have the best application among the candidates this year. She paused. Did he interfere with the selection process? No. A brief silence. I'm just making sure your file gets read by the right person instead of sitting in a processing pile for 6 weeks. That's a thin line. That's a line I won't cross, he said firmly. If you're not good enough, she won't accept you. The outcome is yours. She thought about it. Then she decided to believe it. Where is he? She asked. The office. Pause. The old office. I'm packing up. She looked out the kitchen window, down the street below where a man was pushing his bicycle through a puddle, and a child was pulling her mother toward the bakery on the corner. Normal life was going on out there, seemingly oblivious to anything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. I'm about to make some coffee, she said. If you want a break, come here. There was a silence long enough for her to think he might say no for some valid reason. 45 minutes, he said. Lucian arrived exactly 43 minutes later. He wasn't wearing a suit. It was the first time she'd seen him outside that house without one. A dark blue sweater, dark trousers. He looked so ordinary that it took her a second to process the image as she opened the door. Come in, she said. He stepped into Mireya's small apartment, looking around once, without judgment, just the kind of thing one does when entering a new space. The apartment wasn't large. There was a new sofa and old curtains, and a small potted plant on the windowsill that Mireya had bought on Saturday, with the look of someone buying a plant for the first time without worrying about the electricity bill at the end of the month. Celine made coffee. Lucian sat down in the kitchen chair and said nothing while waiting, the kind of silence that was comfortable in the truest sense of the word, not defensive. She placed the 2 cups on the table and sat down opposite them. Read counsel, she said. What's the progress? The prosecutor says it will take 18 to 24 months to go to trial. Reid has a good legal team. He raised his cup. But the evidence is better than the legal team. Marsh? A cooperation agreement was signed in exchange for a lighter sentence. She confirmed the timeline and provided 3 additional names related to Reid's network that we were previously unaware of. She nodded. My mother. Her lawyer has been working with the prosecutor. Because she was coerced and fully cooperative, it's highly likely there won't be any criminal prosecution. He looked at her. Not sure, but it's likely. Celine held the coffee cup in both hands. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light began to change color from yellow to orange. Brief, because November days are short, because the sun doesn't have time to stay long enough. He said he was cleaning the office, she said. Have. What exactly does that mean? Lucian set the cup down. He looked at the coffee for a second before answering, the kind of look one gets when arranging words in the correct order. The next 18 months will involve a lot of things that need to be handled legally. Operations? I'm transitioning to legal form, assets being restructured, certain relationships needing to be terminated in a way that doesn't create further problems. He looked up. It's legal work, not anything else. I have a team of lawyers. And after 18 months? After 18 months, the things that need to be dealt with will be dealt with. He paused for a second. And I asked about Cornell's return program. The small kitchen was quiet except for the faint sound of the television coming from Mireya's bedroom. And? She asked. And there's the program. It's not easy. It needs to go through a review board, and you need to prove there's no reason why the subsequent licensing would be inappropriate. The corner of his mouth twitched. The latter is the most interesting challenge I've faced in 15 years. Celine looked at him. In the fading orange light streaming through the small kitchen window, in a dark blue sweater with his left arm still bandaged under the sleeve, sitting at the kitchen table of the unpretentious apartment of a woman he had helped without expecting thanks. Lucian Vexley looked like someone trying to live a life he had never had and wasn't sure how to live. It looks like someone is trying it out, and that was different from everything she had seen of him in the previous 2 weeks. The first year will be tough, she said. Not a warning, a fact. I know. He will be the oldest person in the class. Everyone will know who he is. I know. And there will be days when he sits in the lecture hall and wonders if he's going crazy. Perhaps. He looked her straight in the eye. Do you plan to do something with that knowledge? She thought for a moment. I work the night shift in St. Vincent. I have free mornings. That's not the answer to my question. That's all the answer I have right now. She looked at him. The rest isn't the time to talk about. He looked at her for a second, recognizing where that remark came from the hallway of the transit station 3 weeks ago, when she stepped out to walk toward the 2 cars blocking the way and told him that the rest wasn't the time to talk. And now they sit at the kitchen table of their small Astoria apartment, sipping coffee in the fading twilight, and the thing that wasn't the right time to say remains there, not diminished, not changed in form, just waiting for the right moment, in the manner of things that truly matter. The television in the bedroom went off. Footsteps. The door opened and Mireya entered the kitchen, saw Lucian, and stopped. A moment of silence in the small kitchen. Lucian stood up. Wasn't a social reflex. She sensed he had to decide to do it, saw him sit still for a fraction of a second before standing. Mireya Vale looked at the man she had worked for 13 years, the man whose secret she had kept for 15 years, the man to whom they both knew she owed a conversation that Celine had not been a part of. Can I make some more coffee? She said. Lucian looked at her. Thank you. Mireya walked into the kitchen and began making coffee in the way she had done 1,000 times in the kitchen of that house. Familiar movements, performed in her other, smaller, brighter kitchen. Lucian sat back down. Celine looked at her mother, at him, and said nothing because there was nothing to say in this moment that words would spoil. 3 people sat in the small kitchen of their Astoria apartment as the twilight faded and the kitchen lights came on in its place. A warm yellow light, warmer than the twilight, warmer than the white fluorescent lights of the transit station, warmer than the nighttime lights in the library of the house, where all 3 of them had once stood in different corners and looked at each other across a distance that was now, gradually, becoming different. Not entirely different, not immediately, but it's different in that things begin to change, not because of one big decision, but because of a series of small decisions. The decision to sit down instead of getting up, the decision to make coffee instead of going outside, the decision to stay at the kitchen table instead of finding a reason to leave. In January, Celine began her first case at the trauma department of St. Vincent Medical Center. The night shift, 12 hours, began at 7 o'clock in the evening. She put on her uniform for the first time in the changing room hallway and looked in the mirror, not to check how she looked, but something else. The kind people do when they want to remember a moment they know will never repeat in this form. Trauma nursing. She had wanted this since she was 15, when she first read about how people stabilize trauma patients in conditions with insufficient equipment and time and still have to make the right decisions. She stepped out into the hallway and began her shift. Her first patient that night was a man in his 60s who had fallen down the stairs and broken his wrist. It wasn't serious, but it was painful and unsettling in a way unaccustomed to physical pain. She sat down at eye level with him and began talking before doing anything, a technique she'd learned since she was 12 and didn't know was a skill until someone in nursing school called it by its name. 2 hours later, during a short break between shifts, she checked her phone. A message from a number she had saved last week. Meet with the Cornell Review Board tomorrow. 8:00 a.m. She typed back. Get enough sleep. Reply came after 2 minutes. She won't be there to check. She looked at the screen and felt something light in her chest, a lightness that didn't mean nothing was there anymore, but that something had been put in its proper place. I will call at 8:15, she typed, after it's done. There was no immediate answer. She put the phone down and drank her cold coffee in the break room, looking at the shift schedule on the wall. A minute later, the phone rang. K. In March of the following year, on a Saturday morning, Celine sat at the dining table in her apartment, not Mireya's apartment, which she had rented since February, a 20-minute walk from the hospital, and reviewed material for the midterm exam she had agreed to help someone with. He sat opposite her with his second cup of coffee and a neuroanatomy textbook open before him, a pencil in hand but unwritten for 10 minutes because she had just asked the question he was thinking of. The basal ganglia, she said. Lucian looked up from the page of his book. In his first year, he got the position wrong on the test, she recalled. I'm not mistaken about the location. He looked at her. I'm mistaken about the function. Then, the function. He put down his pencil, glanced toward the window for a second, not to avoid the question, but rather as if he were retrieving information from where his brain stored it, rather than from the page in front of him. The basal ganglia are involved in voluntary motor control, procedural learning, and some cognitive and emotional functions. He looked back at her. They don't initiate movement but regulate and refine movement that has already been initiated from the cerebral cortex. Good, she noted. Next sentence. She looked down at the list of review questions. The March sun streamed through her apartment window, a different kind of sun than November's, warmer, more persistent, the kind that began to linger a little longer each day. She put the paper down. Are you all right? She asked. Not about the test. Lucian looked at her. He knew she wasn't asking about the test. Yesterday in practical class, he said, his voice unhurried, there was a simulation exercise of surgery. Not real surgery, a simulation on a model. The instructor asked each of us to perform a basic suture. She waited. I haven't held a surgical needle in 17 years. He looked down at his right hand. I didn't know it was still in my hand until I picked up a needle and started. And the instructor stood there and said nothing for a minute. The corner of his mouth twitched. Then he said he wanted me to do it again next time, a little more carelessly, so he could point out areas for improvement. Celine looked at him. At the hand resting on the table, fingers stretched out on the wooden surface. The hand that had learned to do that 17 years ago and hadn't forgotten. He's fine, she said. Not the question this time. Yes. He picked up his coffee cup. Ask your next question. She looked at him for another second. The man sitting at her dining table in the March sunshine with his neuroanatomy book and second cup of coffee, who was relearning what he already knew and learning things he didn't know, and who looked like he was doing it not because he had no other choice, but because it was what he chose, looked at him and felt something that had no neat name but could be described by saying it was just an ordinary day. It wasn't a special day. No danger, no new secrets to be revealed, no decisions to be made within 20 minutes. Just a Saturday morning with coffee and books, sunshine through the window, and the next review question. A normal day, it turns out, is the most expensive thing one can have. She looked down at the paper. The limbic system, she read. Its role in regulating emotions and memory. Lucian set his cup down and began to answer. The sun continued to shine through the window. They both remained seated at the table, and neither of them is surviving anything. They are simply alive.